how's it now? Better? Okay, now you can hear my beautiful voice. So, what I was saying was that, yes, this is my third time here in, what is this place, Tampere University of Technology, right? And the previous two times, my lectures have been about tooling, front-end tooling, how to use stuff like Webpack or Gulp or Grunt. Now I'm kind of conscious if my slides are working. But today I'm going to talk about React. Has anyone used React? How many of you have used it before? So you have some kind of, at least like I see 3 kind of shy hands there. So some of you have used React before. And as I've understood it, you guys have now gone through a journey of trying to learn web development, and now you've finally reached something super interesting, which is React. And at least in my opinion, React is pretty much the most important and, I don't know, most used library at the moment for rendering views when you're building websites. Or you can build other stuff with React as well. And at any point, if you have any questions, I think the most value I can provide here is by answering your questions, because I have no idea what the skill level of yours is. So it's better if you just raise your hand and ask a question than if I'm just here going around about this subject. Anyway, this is the agenda for the next 1.5 hours, I think. So we'll first go through a bit about what's React, what you can do with it, why someone came up with it, and then we go through some of the core concepts, for instance, virtual DOM and the component-based thinking, and maybe some other ones as well. We had a great discussion while we were coming here about some technical details of React that would be super interesting to also tell you guys about, but I don't know if we have time. And as a final thing, I would kind of want to go and talk a bit about state and what is state in a web application and how it can be handled when using React. But in any case, all of this will be a bit of a leap if you've only done web development as static web pages before. I don't know what you guys have been doing here, but as I understood it, you understand what's a single page application. You understand that there can be a backend, like a Python Django backend, and then you have a web application as a separate, kind of like a separate thing, as a client in a way. But, so React in itself is just a library for rendering user interfaces. And you can do some stuff with it, but it's mostly just related to creating views, creating something the user sees, something the user can interact with, like the user can click a button and the user can see the button, but it doesn't really have any opinion to do the underlying logic of your application. That can be, you can have the backends and backends on other services there somewhere, and you can have the logic how data is fetched to your client as a separate thing, but React doesn't provide you with anything when it comes to that. And what I would use React for is I kind of now realize that maybe I should have given a bit more introduction also from the technical point of view, but what I would use React for is building dynamic web pages, and not just web pages, but also applications. And just if you have something dynamic that the user can interact with and it changes like in real time in a way, then that's a good fit for React. But if you are building a website for your for your dog, or I don't know what you would build a website for, but like a static website, then I don't know if React is the best tool for that. It's a bit too hardcore for something as simple. So if you're building just a normal HTML page, then you might not need React. But for pretty much everything else, if you have any logic whatsoever, then I would maybe use it. And here some code. I don't know if you can you actually see that? Should have a bit more contrast. You don't have, you don't have to start reading it or anything, but as I said, React can be used for multiple platforms. It started as a web library, but then people came up with React Native, and with React Native, you can kind of use the same paradigm of writing JavaScript, but also for native platforms, such as iOS, Android, televisions these days, I guess, like Android TV, Apple TV, Windows. What else do we have? Probably some like smart fridges or something you could use React for. You can use it pretty much for everything. You can use it for game development as well, which is quite cool. And if you've ever seen this app, the Vappu app, I don't know, how many of you have ever seen this? Is this something new? Cool, some of you know this. So this was also built with React Native, and that's a project that we at the Futurists have used as a boilerplate for a bunch of different other projects. So maybe you could also say that once you build one project with React Native, it's kind of applicable to all sorts of use cases. You can use the same like modules and components you've written for a bunch of other stuff. And you can also find loads of components online that other people have made. For instance, Bootstrap, if you've heard about it, it's like a component library for HTML and CSS. So you can find React kind of like bindings or React modules for that as well. Same goes for Ant Design, which is also like a component library. But the point being, you don't have to write that much code yourself if you're using React. Any questions so far? No questions. All right.
You said that you can run React everywhere, everything, anyways, like smart visual stuff.
Yeah.
What is the biggest place you have run React?
Well, I don't want to talk about that. No, but seriously, maybe like smart watches have been one of the weirdest use case. And also Apple TV. I once started writing an app for Apple TV, and yeah, never finished it, but at least I tried it, and it kind of worked. It's kind of experimental, to be honest. But another thing, why I think React is great is that it's really easy to learn. People at Facebook have done an amazing job in writing documentation for it, and I would be amazed if you wouldn't get how it works just by reading the React documentation page. And a cool story, actually, is that I was studying in Tampere University, and we had a project work course, and none of the other people in my team had used any web technologies before, but we still wanted to go with React because it seemed simple. And we were able to deliver the app, and other people were also able to contribute to the front-end client, which was quite cool. It took, I don't know, 2 weeks for some to start actually working on it and start writing code. So I would say that it's fairly easy, especially if you know JavaScript, then it should be like a piece of cake. Anyway, here's some actual example code. Here's how it would look in reality. So the basic idea is that you build these functions, or write these functions, or classes, that all represent a component. A component can mean anything from a whole website to a button or a piece of text. And you define a function that returns something that looks a bit like HTML. We'll come back to that a bit later on. And then you just tell React to, there's a library called React DOM. It's named React DOM because React can be used for all sorts of platforms, so there's a separate library called React DOM that you can use for web pages. You tell React DOM to render the function, the component that you just made. You tell it as a second parameter, you tell it where to render it. But now, I'm just gonna, I have a project, well, not set up, but I'll show you how I would start writing a new React project using a cool tool called Create React App, if everything works. I think I need to sit down, if it's okay. And at any point, if something's confusing, just ask. So I don't really just want to be lecturing here. I want more of a kind of like a conversation going on here. But how do I do this again? Viewer display. Just hope that I don't have any work-related stuff here open or anything NDA stuff. Probably not. So, is this something that you can see if I type something here? Everyone, also you guys at the back? Cool beans. So, I have this tool installed called Create React App. Oh, actually, don't need that one. That you can use for bootstrapping a new React project. And you can get this tool by, I don't know, just Google it, I guess. But it's really simple to install and really easy to use as well. So Create React App plus the project name. This is the most difficult part about any project, coming up with a name. Let me just call it, I don't know, my app. And what it does is that it creates a new directory for it, installs a bunch of dependencies, sets everything up, does a bit of magic here and there, and then it's done. It also gives you a bunch of errors that I won't get into because I already have another React project here set up somewhere. But how it looks like when you got it working is something like this. And again, can you guys see that? Let's zoom in a bit. So what it does is that it creates a directory. This project is called React-project, and the directory has a subdirectory called Node Modules, a public directory, and a SRC directory. And the SRC directory is the stuff that you put your code into, and the public one is just some static HTML, like bootstrapping stuff that you don't really need to care about, especially in the beginning. It creates you a couple of files, an index.js that uses the same kind of thingy that we just saw. It uses the React DOM library to render the app to the web page, and it creates you one example component. I've actually deleted some of the files that it creates automatically just to make it a bit clearer. So don't get surprised when you see weird-looking files here and there. And it also creates a bootstrap for all the build setup, all the webpacks and whatnots, because those things can be super annoying to set up. You can easily, if you want to do this yourself, it's not. I'm not dissing React or anything, but like those modern build tools are fairly complex. Like so complex that some of the projects that I've been in have used I've used like a week or so just configuring the build setup, which is, I don't know, less than ideal, I guess. Anyway, the way you start the project then, when you have it installed, you just say npm start. And if you're not familiar with npm is the package manager for Node.js. I don't know if you've talked about Node.js at all. All right, okay. Well, that's everything you need to know. It's just a package manager that you can use also for running scripts. Let me just close all of that off. So here now is my app. It's nothing more than just an empty div. But what I could do now is I could just add a bunch of stuff here. Hello. And it should render it quite nicely here. And that's kind of, maybe that's the hello world with React. Especially with Create React app, it's super easy. You can just start working without any of the hassle. Anything you want to ask or add? You can also add something if I forgot. Yes?
So we are writing all of our code is like in app.js, and how we will include it in the HTML, like maybe we just call app.js, or is it compiled to some actual JavaScript, because we cannot just import this JavaScript because it's not standard JavaScript.
That's an excellent question.
Can you just show us the HTML file where you are including the JavaScript file and how it is included?
Yes, that's a great question, because that's exactly what my next slide is about. It's almost like you knew that beforehand, but yes, it's an excellent question. How can we be doing this? And let me just remove the mirroring once again, because otherwise I can't see my notes. I made these slides last night, so I can't really remember what these were about. Anyway, yes. So yeah, the HTML-looking syntax is something called JSX, and it's non-standard JavaScript syntax. Can I just open up the link here? Nope. I can show you what it means in actuality, but the summary of it is that, is there a sound thingy again? I think it's broken. Hey, I think it works now. I actually think it's this one, and not this one. Okay, I'll just have it there. Damn computers, hate them. Anyway, what was I saying again? Yeah, the syntax, it's JSX, and oh, there's a small display here as well. So what it actually means is that, for instance, here in the React document, you have a hello message component, which also has like divs and such as kind of like HTML, JSX. And here's a tab that you can click to remove the JSX syntax. And here's what it actually looks like. It gets compiled from the HTML-looking syntax to this, these function calls, basically. But the reason why it exists, is that if we take a look at something a bit more complicated, for instance, this example here, and I turn off JSX again, you see that this kind of, at least in my opinion, starts to be a bit unreadable. Like compared to having it as something that looks like HTML, it's much easier to read. And imagine having like an actual, like a huge enterprise application. This would be just, I don't know, I would probably just pack my bag and go home if this was something I saw at work. So that's the reason why it exists. And when React first came out, for many, many years, people had there was this idea that you should not write HTML to JavaScript files. And that was correct, because usually when you have also HTML files, then you have some HTML in the HTML files and some HTML in the JavaScript files, it kind of creates loads of confusion. Because if you see something there on the website, you want to go and edit that, you now don't know where it's actually coming from. So there was this idea that people said that, hey, this React library, it's not good because there's this thing called separation of concerns. So HTML files should only have HTML in them. JS files, only JavaScript in them. CSS files, only styles in them. But then someone was kind of against that, saying that, yeah, there is, like, it makes sense, but in a sense, you are separating one concept to different kind of technologies or different files. So it makes it a bit more complicated. And in actuality, this kind of separation of HTML, JS, and CSS for this button, for instance, here, it's not separation of concerns, it's separation of technologies, which isn't the same thing. And if you would want to have separation of concerns, you would do it this way, that you would have like these categories of button has styles, functionality, markup in it, same for header, same for everything you wanna have on your website. Which kind of brings me into the topic of component-based thinking. And this was something I mentioned in the beginning, that instead of having HTML and JS and CSS files, it could actually be better to just have files that represent one concept, like a button, for instance, that would encapsulate everything that is related to that button. And things kind of started changing, and for a long time, the way these websites, for instance, were built was that there's a designer that comes to you with a design, for instance, this beautiful website here, and they ask you to just implement this view. I just want this view as HTML, or here's the mobile view for that. And what it kind of meant for developers was that you had to, it is kind of how it would look as a React component, but you had to create these massive HTML templates, or I don't know, this is just a mess to me, and loads of repetition, and you wouldn't, in any programming language, you would not write something like this. This just doesn't make any sense. I have this code example, actually, that I want to show you guys. Where's my cursor? Here. the resolution on that thing is just super small. Anyway, this is a PHP file that I wrote like 10 years ago. It's just kind of like a huge barf of code. It doesn't have any function or anything in it. It's just a massive file filled with garbage code. So it kind of, for some reason, it kind of reminds me of that. Like, there's the thing called NoSQL for databases. So this, I would call this like no abstraction. It could be cool one day, though. And yeah, then you have the mobile view. You would do exactly the same thing for the mobile view. But the way the component-based thinking that React kind of encourages you to do is that you would have the website here, and now you would start kind of separating out like well-defined small pieces of functionality. So for instance, you would have a card component. It was from the page. Card, you have 5 of them there. You could have a component called cards. It could be the container for those cards. Then on a higher level, you could have a header component. And inside the header component, you would have logo, search, and the code after that would look much cleaner. Of course, that's not all the functionality that we had in the actual web page, but it's much nicer to read. And you end up pushing technical details to a level kind of lower. For the reader of the code, it's much easier to read something like this compared to the first example I had here. There's just too much information. You don't need that information. If you want to actually like drill into a navigation, for instance, then maybe you want to see what the actual URLs are. But when you're just kind of like reading through code, just trying to understand how it works, it's much better to just have a high-level summary of how it works. And you can also pass in properties, like for instance here, there's those card components. All of them had a different title and picture and all of that. So you can pass in dynamic data inside the separate components. Any questions so far? Does it look good? Does it look something like that you would want to try? Nice one, nice one. So I say that, I'm not even kidding when I say that this is actually pretty important if you want to build websites also in the future. It's one of the best tools that's out there. And you can, of course, there's loads of hype around it, and there's a certain kind of culture that I don't really even like that much. But it's there for a reason. It's a really nice tool. Do you guys want to take a small break now or a bit later? No. Nice. Yes. Good call. Me neither. I can show you how to create components like this then, with my own small hands. Oh yeah, I have the small mini display here. Yes. So, this is where we left our app before. We only have a stupid app component with only one one div inside of it with the text hello. And we could create another component to put inside this. Let me just clean up a bit before get to work. So, for instance, I could create a title component that takes in a property called text, for instance. And let's give it something. And yeah, let's have a couple of them. And now for the title component. The way to create a new component is exactly like what we have here. So you can either use a function or a class like this. And for this, I decided to use a function because this will be a super simple component in a sense that it doesn't need to have any other functionality besides being able to render the properties that it's given. So title is an H1 element. If I just go ahead and put something here, we can see that it now renders 5 titles. But because I want to have hello world there, and I want this these things to be coming from here, I need to what's the word? I need to declare an argument called props. And instead of this hard-coded message here, I can now just say props.text. And text, of course, comes from the fact that I used text here. It could be anything. It could be LOL. Still works the same way. But that's how you do a small, simple component. Now I'm thinking if there would be something even cooler that I could show you, but to me, this is quite cool in itself. Yes, this is exactly what the client asked for. An app that has 5 titles, one of them being Hello World. And yeah, that's what I'm paid for. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and the design looks just brilliant. Yeah, it's marketing these days. It's really hard to understand. But the next thing, I can't even remember what the next thing was. But in a way, like when you're building components inside components, like we just did, we put the title tag inside the app tag of the component. You could also have another component inside the title component, and you kind of start creating this tree of components. Why don't I have the thingy here again? Just a second. Yes, much better. And this example here, for instance, could be something like how Facebook has the component tree, or how Twitter works. It has a page component as the first main top-level component. Then inside of that, you could have a header, a feed. I don't know if anyone actually uses Facebook anymore, because I certainly don't. A footer, and yeah, kind of goes deeper and deeper. And a cool thing about these components is that, for instance, in this use case, you have the username and avatar components in 2 different places, And it could even be the same component now. You would only have to write the code once. Did I have another part about the state, like how to put state inside a component? I'm just now thinking if I had something else in my mind that I wanted to share. Well, any questions? Yes?
Is there any performance difference between functional component or class component? You define a function and you say whenever we want to present the data, so it's better to use the function.
Yep.
And if we have some logic, then it's better to use class. So
Yep.
is there any performance difference also?
That's an excellent question. Yes, there probably is a tiny difference. Because if you're using a function component, then React can instantaneously tell that it's not going to change at all. Like the properties that are given to it are the only thing that determines whether it needs to be re-rendered or not. Whereas with a class component, it might be a bit different. But what I always find myself telling people is that, well, you can of course disagree, but it's such a small performance difference that I would always focus on the readability of the component. And with functional components, the function components, it makes it easier to read, because when reading it, you can have the assumption that it's first of all, it doesn't have any state in it. It's just the thing that it renders, the thing that it returns, the HTML, is always the only thing that the component does in a way. Whereas with the class components, we'll get to that a bit later on if you're wondering what I'm talking about. But with the class components, it's not as simple. But maybe I wouldn't worry about it too much. I would always, generally speaking, when building web applications, I would always focus on the readability of everything. Because the performance things are just such small details that if you focus on those too much, you might just make it difficult for yourself, I guess. But yeah, someone might disagree with me. Anyway, a break time now. Let's see you guys in 15 minutes. Yes. Have you ever heard the word state before in programming context? Can someone explain what it means? Does someone wanna? I can also do it. So state. Trying to come up with a good example of what state could be. But it's kind of like if you imagine a game, a Super Mario, for instance. The thing that you see on the telly is just a representation of what the state of the game is there on the background. So if the Mario is, how does it work again? Small, then you only have one life left. If you walk a bit with Mario, then the state of the player, the X and Y changes. Or from a real life, if you have a switch of some kind of like a light switch, it can be on or off. It has state, and the button itself is just the fact that the lights are on is just a representation of what the state of that switch is. That was a weird example, I know. Just came up with it. So that's state, and in a web application, state might mean something like, is the user logged in? Or if you're typing into a text input, you type your name, or I type my name, Riku, then the state of that text input is that it has the text Riku inside of it. And the thing that you should see is just the visual representation of that. It's just a layer in front of your eyes, but like the actual text Riku is somewhere in the memory of the computer, something. And without state, it doesn't make any sense to build software at all. State, if you would have a program that doesn't have any state at all, it could be quite. Would it be useful at all? Probably not. So, talking about useful programs, a program that I could show you how to build is this kind of a program. A very useful one. So the only thing it does is that it counts. It shows you how many times you've clicked the button. It's kind of like one of those games, like the cookie clicker, for instance. It's a really good one. So this is kind of like an MVP version of that game. And I will show you how you could build this. But before that, we could think about how exactly this should work. What kind of steps do we need to take for this to work? And I've gathered this backlog of features that we need to implement. So what do we need? What are the basic blocks? We need some state. We need somewhere to store the number of how many times the button has been clicked, starting from 0. That's the initial state. We need a way to capture the button is now pressed. And then from there, we need a way to update the state, to count. Just add one. And now I'm going to sit down again. And show you how it's made. No, this is not what I want. It's a bit annoying that I always have to set this up when I switch between the two modes. So, oh man, the resolution. Yes, it's more like it. So, back to our app, our Hello World app. We want to add a button and a number display. And in a sense, if you want to use this app later on as your, what is it called? A visitor counter app. You can freely use this code. You just have to write it down, because I'm not going to share it later on. Anyway, title. Let's use the title component for this, because I don't want to build a new component. So let's say the text that the title will have is that you've clicked the button 0 times. And let's add the button. Click here. It's a bit of a small button, but I guess everyone can see it. And at the moment, if I click the button, nothing happens. I'm just rendering stuff. It's just static. The number 0 is there, static thing. So the next thing that we want to do, or that we could do, is to capture the capture when I'm clicking this button. And on top of having these custom properties that you can define yourself, React also implements some predefined props that you can use, for instance, for elements like button, such as onClick. And then I could create a function, or let's create a method for this class called, Well, we'll need a method for adding to that number anyway, so I'm going to call it add click. And here I'm going to refer to that method, this add click. So whenever the button is clicked, call this function add click, method. And as a first step, we could just add an alarm, like a pop-up, whenever the button is clicked, just so we know that it works. Just something stupid. Oh, no, it's alert. I click the button, and here it is, a pop-up. But this is not what we want. We want the number here to change. So we need to add the initial state for this component, which could be, I'm thinking what the name for that, well, it doesn't really matter what the name for that variable is, but you need to define a state for this component, and times clicked will be the name for the variable or the property. And now what we can do is we can refer to that number from our text. I'm using this kind of template string here that you may or may not be familiar with, but it's just a normal string with the ability to add variables inside of it, kind of like string interpolation. And I'm going to use our this state dot times clicked. So this dot state in this case refers to this state property here. And nothing should change now because it hasn't been clicked at all. And even though if I try and click it, it still says hello, but it doesn't do what we want because this part of the thing has not been implemented. Are you following? Is there something that is, all right, nice, cool. It seems everyone is. And if you're not, it's fine. It's especially if you're not familiar with JavaScript, the most hipster JavaScript syntax. It might take some tries before you get it right, but the React documentation, like I mentioned, A++. So, add click. What we need to do here is that we need to add 1 to this times clicked. And how we could do it is that we call this function or this method that React provides us with. It comes from the component class that we extend from. Component class comes from the React library, and it's called this set state. And the way you use it, there's few different ways to use this function because the API has changed a lot. But the classic way of using it is to call set state with a fraction of the state that you want to be changed. Because you could potentially have multiple different things here. So you can just add an object here, times clicked, and for its value you would say the same way as we did here. You can copy paste this, and what we can do is this dot state dot times clicked plus 1. And I think now it should work. Wow. Nice. And now you can just sell this product for millions of dollars in Silicon Valley. Can be called the button clicker. Yes. Very nice. But as for the next thing, let me just go back to my previous setup. So the thing that you saw there is called a stateful component. That kind of the same thing that you asked, if there's a difference between those function components that we used in the beginning and these kind of class components. And the difference between them is that with the function component, you can't have any state. There is something that's going to change in React API that lets you do it, but we don't have to worry about that now. But as a general rule, you can't do it with the function components. But you can do it with the class components. And from the readability point of view, whenever you see a function component, you know that it doesn't have any state of its own. So you know that it's dumb in a way, because it only takes in properties, renders something as output. But you know that it won't ever change. It's deterministic in a way. It's pure, if you want. And when you build trees of components like this, the yellow ones here could be the ones with some state in them. So you start building a huge tree of components. Some of them will be stateful, some of them not. And what it means in practice is that sometimes things happen in your application and you're not entirely sure why that is. Because if the state is kind of sprinkled around the whole huge massive component tree, then it's sometimes hard to debug. You have to kind of go through different components. Where is this change coming from? I don't know. But we'll get back to that a little bit later on. No, we actually come to that part now because it's the next slide. So a solution for that Facebook came up with. React is made by Facebook. I kind of forgot to mention that. So Facebook had this issue. They had the chat, Facebook Messenger, maybe like 10 years ago. And I don't know if you guys can remember, but when it initially first came out, it kind of sucked. It was super bad. It was like laggy. Sometimes you saw the message notification on the top bar, even though you did not have a message at all. It was weird, and people were always saying that, man, that Facebook Messenger is just a piece of garbage. And it was. And the Facebook team then put millions of dollars to develop it to be better. And what they came up with, or the issue that they pinpointed, was that it's because of the state of the messenger. And what it means, or what it meant for them, was that whenever, for instance, you get a message, you click the small message box there at the bottom, and for that message, it goes to the top bar, and it needs to clear the state that now you have unread messages. So there's loads of different like wires going everywhere. That, okay, you click this thing, then we need to clear off that number from there. Oh, now you got a new message. Now let's create a new message window. So it was just so complicated, and that's why it became so crappy, because they couldn't handle it anymore. So they came up with the solution. What if we would have all the components, kind of like those functions, all the components be like those function components that we saw, like dumb components, in a sense that they would be just functions that would take in props, render something, but no state would be anywhere else besides from that purple thingy. Kind of like you would only have one place where all the application state would be stored. You can imagine it being like one global variable somewhere or whatever. But the idea was that you would just have one place to put everything to. And from there, from that place, you would push the user profile to the components, or the hosts would go to the feed, or the messages would go to the what are those called? The boxes, small boxes, the Facebook Messenger chat. You've used it, and that was a kind of like a revolutionary idea for them. It's not a new idea. It's been around for I don't even know how long, probably from the beginning of times. But the idea was that the data would kind of just flow to one direction, always to the view from this container, from this, not container, but from this, I don't know, toilet of state. And if something needs to be changed, if the components want to change something, they will have to push events back to the purple box. And the purple box in itself determines what to do with those events. And it does something. It fetches something from the back end or whatever, changes the state and pushes the new state back to the components. The components don't really, they wouldn't have any state, or they would be dumb in a sense. And this is kind of what Redux, or this is not kind of what Redux is based on, this is exactly what Redux is based on. Facebook first came up with this architecture called Flux, and it was just the idea of having one place to store the data, or store the state, having the component tree as just pure functions, just functions that take in properties, return views, and those components, functions, would then push events back to the purple box. And there were loads of different implementations of this. This is actually, if you're interested, the actual name for this architecture pattern is message something. Can you remember? Message? No, it's something called, well, anyway, doesn't really matter. You can find that just by Googling. But it's an architecture that Microsoft, I think, came up with for Windows many decades ago. That React kind of now just took and said that it's our thing. And people started creating implementations on top of that. It was just an idea, but there was no way of actually using it with React code. So people started making implementations of it, and there were loads, tens of different ways of doing the same exact thing. And then Redux kind of surfaced, and it was the winner of in some way of those libraries. And it became a thing. People have been using Redux for years now. And I think you should do. It's probably the simplest way of managing state in React applications. So yes, this is how it would. I should have shown this slide before, but this is how it would look in practice. There are some of the components, the ones that we had as stateful ones previously, are just now receiving stuff from Redux store and pushing events back to it. You could also visualize this whole thing as just a cycle of like how data flows to components, and how from components the actions flow back to the data store, the Redux store. But instead of doing that, I give you this beautiful presentation. And all the components remain stateless, besides for the fact that some components, the ones that were stateful previously, now needs to be just connected to the store somehow. So Redux also provides you with kind of like a React wrapper. And so Redux is nothing more than just a state management library. You can use it with Vue You can use it with any JavaScript view library. You can use it with Angular.js. You can use it with, like, if you're just building HTML page with some JavaScript, you could still use Redux. It's not. It has, in a way, it has nothing to do with React at all. But I don't know. People just combine them because they work well together, and it was kind of built for the React paradigm in the first place. Because the fact is that I don't really want to be adding Redux to our small project now, because that would completely blow it up. I'm just going to ask if any one of you has any questions about anything web related, or Redux or React, or cooking. I also know something about that. No questions whatsoever. But anyway, this was pretty much all the stuff that I had. Thanks for all your time. There's a great thing that I maybe can advertise a bit. We're doing a podcast called webbidevaus.fi. It's in Finnish though, unfortunately, but if you're interested about this stuff, it's a podcast made by me and my colleague Antti Mattila from Futuris. What? Yes, I will. Yes, that's a really good point actually. How did I miss that? Where do I have my? So webbidevaus.fi. We've done maybe 20 episodes now. Looks like this. But yeah, like I said, still in Finnish. And it's nothing futurist related in a way. It's just our own thing that we like to do. But if nothing else, if you can't learn anything from the podcast, at least we have super amazing jokes. So prepare to laugh your ass off. Anyway, thanks a lot.